I had no land, no claim, and no place at the table by the second week of September in the year 1886. And the thing I remember best is not the words my sister's husband used, but the way he folded the deed back into its envelope before he had finished, speaking as if the matter were already closed and I were only the last to learn it. That we stood in the yard of the Vance place outside Loop City, on the high tableland of central Nebraska, where the wind came across the grass with nothing to slow it, and Harlan Vance told me was not bread enough in his house for a woman who would not marry and would not be told. I was 31. My sister Della stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and did not come down the step. And I understood from that, more than from anything Harlan said, that the decision had been made between them in the night and that her silence was the price of her own keeping. I took my father's tin trunk, my good knife, and the dog, and I walked out to the quarters section nobody wanted, the dry bench above the draw that the neighbors called the rind, and I did not yet understand that the very thing they had cast me out for knowing would, before the snow melted, be the reason a dozen of them were still breathing. If you have ever been handed your own coat and shown the road by people who owed you better, stay with me a while, because this is a story about what the road gave back. I will tell it plainly, the way my father told things, and I will not hurry it. My father was Tomas Pierce, and he came to this country as a provisioner's boy out of a Cornish fishing town where nothing was ever thrown away that could be salted, smoked, or hung in the rafters until a hungry month came for it. He died when I was 26 of a chest cold that turned hard in a February that gave him no quarter, and he left me no money, for there was none to leave. What he left me lived in my hands. He left me the knowledge of how to take a thing at the peak of its keeping and stop it there, hold it against rot, the way you hold a door against wind, so that a tomato off the vine in August could feed a body in March, if you treated it right and treated it in time. He used to say that the only inheritance worth the name was the kind that could not be stolen, burned, or voted away from you, and I thought it a sad thing to say from a man with empty pockets. And I did not understand it until I stood on the rind with my tin trunk and saw that he had been right, that nobody could take from me the one thing I truly owned. He taught me with his hands first and his words after. He would slice an apple thin as paper and hold it to the light and say, "See how the flesh wants to give up its water. All you do is help it." And then he would set the rings on a screen in the loft where the dry air moved, and weeks later he would press one to my lips, and it would be sweet as candy and light as a leaf. The rind was 40 acres of hardpan and buffalo grass on a bench above a dry draw, and it had passed through 3 failed claimants before it came open again, and the men in town said it would break a fourth. There was a soddy on it already, half fallen, dug into the south face of the rise where the previous man had quit, and there was a spring seep at the bottom of the draw that ran thin but ran clean, and there was nothing else but sky. The dog was a brown shepherd cross named Pell, low and broad and patient, who had been my father's dog before he was mine, and who lay down in the doorway of that ruined soddy as if he had decided the question of whether we would stay. I had brought what would fit in a trunk, which was my father's screens, his salt box, a coil of waxed twine, 2 good knives, the family Bible with the births set down in the front, and a journal of his in which he had drawn the lofts and racks and smoke boxes of his trade, in a careful hand with the airflow marked by little arrows like a man drawing weather. I had no plow worth the name and no team. What I had was September, and a country that did not yet know it was about to be tested, and a head full of my father's arrows. I want to tell you what the town saw, because it matters to the rest. They saw a woman with no man and no crop, turned out by her own family, scratching at a dead claim and hauling baskets up from the draw. They saw me at the soddy mouth all through that warm, dry autumn cutting things into thin pieces and laying them on screens in the sun, squash and pumpkin in coins, apples from the Vance's own windfall that Della left at the property line in a basket without a word, wild plums from the draw, the last of a neighbor's bolted beans, strips of meat from a deer a kind man named Otto Vogel brought me and would not be paid for. They saw the screens covered at night against the dew and uncovered at dawn, and the soddy roof I had rebuilt, hung inside with drying racks until it looked, a man said, like the inside of a witch's chimney. The first to give it a name was Cyrus Hale, who kept the store in Loop City and the porch in front of it where the talking got done, and he said it to my face the day I came in for salt, looking at the brine stain on my cuffs. "Here comes the rind woman," he said, not unkindly, "the way you would name a stray." And the men on the porch laughed the easy laugh of men who are warm and fed and certain, and the name stuck to me like burr, the rind woman. It followed me down the street. I did not answer Cyrus then, and I will tell you now I never answered him the way the hot part of me wanted to. My father had a rule about that too. He said, a thing proven needs no argument, and a thing unproven gets none worth having. So you keep your mouth and keep your work, and let the year do your talking. So I kept my work. Through all of late September and into October, I rose before the sun cleared the draw, and I cut until the light failed, and the cutting was the whole of the craft. For my father had taught me that the knife does more than the fire ever will. Too thick and the slice rots from the middle before its skin dries, he told me, and too thin and it crumbles to dust and feeds no one, and the right of it is the width of a coin and no other. And you learn it in your wrist and not your eye. I cut squash into coins until my hand knew the thickness without measuring. I cut the apples Della left at the line into rings and threaded them on twine and hung them in loops from the rebuilt rafters like a strange harvest of pale wheels. I cut the venison Otto brought along the grain into strips no thicker than a finger, rubbed them with salt from Cyrus Hale's own barrel, and hung them in muslin sleeves to keep the flies off while the air did its slow work. The soddy itself I made over into a drying loft, and that was my father's journal speaking through my hands, for he had drawn the thing on its pages 40 years before, in a country I had never seen. I pried the fallen sod off the south roof and laid new poles, and set my screens up under the ridge where the heat gathered, and I cut a low vent at the foot of the north wall, and a high one at the peak of the south, so the warm air drew up and across and out, carrying the water off the racks, the way a chimney carries smoke, and never a slice of it touched another slice, for crowding is what kills a loft, my father said, the want of moving air between. I tested the draw of it with a thread of wool smoke and watched it bend and climb just as his little arrow said it would, and I stood in that doorway and felt the dead man's plan working in the living air, and I was not lonesome in that hour, whatever else I was. The seep at the bottom of the draw ran cold even in the warm afternoons, and I learned that the air off it, drawn up the slope at dusk, was cool and dry both, and I hung my meat lowest where that air reached it, and it cured sweet and never turned. I filled the loft with what I made, and I want you to understand it was not a few jars on a shelf. It was a wall of food. I laid the dried squash coins in barrels between sheets of clean paper, light as poker chips and gone the color of dark honey. I braided onions and hung them in ropes along the wall. I put up beans in sacks gone hard and light as gravel, and apple leather rolled like bolts of cloth, and plum paste from the draw fruit pressed into crocks under a skin of wax against the air, and pumpkin dried to amber chips that would swell back to soup in a pot of water. I keep account of things the way my father kept his, and I set it down each evening in the back of his journal in my own hand under his. The pounds of this and the pounds of that, and by the first hard frost I had put by something near 400 pounds of food that would not spoil, on a claim that had grown me almost nothing, and I had done it with a knife, the sun, the wind off the draw, and a dead man's arrows. There is a kind of arithmetic that does not look like much until the day it is the only arithmetic that matters. It was Otto Vogel who first said the word that scared me, and he said it gently, the way you would mention a stain on a man's coat that he could not see. He had come up the draw with another quarter of venison in November, and he stood in my doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at the wall of hung food and then out at the sky, which had gone the color of a dirty fleece, and stayed there for 3 days running. He said the geese had gone over early and gone over high and gone over all at once, and that the muskrats in the slough below his place had built their houses thick as he had ever seen. And the old Pawnee man who cut wood for him would not say what he thought but had laid in twice his usual cord. Bad sign on bad sign, Otto said. Then he looked at my food again and he said, you may have done a strange thing at a good time. And I did not know yet how strange or how good. He took his coffee and he went home before the dark, and Pell walked him to the head of the draw and came back and lay across my feet. And I sat up late that night listening to a wind that had a new edge in it, a thin whine under the broad push of it, like a second voice come into the room. I have skipped ahead of myself, and I want to go back and tell you about the day Cyrus Hale said the name to me the second time, because it was worse than the first, and because it was the day the lone voice spoke up for me and was overruled, which is a thing I have never forgotten. It was the third Sunday of November. At the church social held in the schoolhouse outside town, the last gathering before the weather closed the roads, I had not meant to go. I went because Della sent word through the Vogels that she wished to see me, and I went hungry for the sight of my sister, and what I got instead was a room that went quiet by degrees as I came through the door. Cyrus stood by the stove with a plate in his hand, warm and easy, the center of the men as he always was, and he saw me and he said it loud enough to carry. Well, the Rind woman has come down off her hill, he said. Maybe she has brought us a supper of leaves and bark. The men laughed, and a woman I did not know laughed, and it was a young homesteader named Ruth Tisdale, no older than 20, with a baby on her hip, who said into the quiet after the laugh, my mother died for 40 years, and we never went hungry a winter, and there is no shame in it. The room did not take it up. Cyrus smiled at her the way you smile at a child who has spoken out of turn, and he said, your mother had a man to keep the larder, and the talk moved on. And Ruth looked at me across the room with her face gone red, and I gave her the only thing I had to give, which was a small nod that said I heard you, and I have not forgotten it. I did not get to speak to Della. Harlan steered her out before the meal, and I watched the back of her shawl go through the door, and I drove the borrowed cart home through a dark that had teeth in it, with Pell pressed warm against my side and the first dry flakes ticking against the canvas like sand. I want to be honest about that night, because I have read enough stories where the wronged woman drives home full of fire and plots her triumph, and that is not how it was. I drove home tired and lonesome and aching for a sister who would not lift her hand for me, and I thought not one thought of being proven right. I thought about whether the meat sleeves were hung high enough that the air would still reach them in a cold snap. I thought about my father. That is the truth of how the cast out spend their nights. Not in vengeance, in inventory. And if you have spent a night that way, counting what you have against what is coming, I think you already know the rest of this story in your body even before I tell it. It came on the morning of the 9th of January, and it did not come the way the summer storms came, loud and from one quarter. It came as a stillness first, a strange held breath over the whole country, the cattle standing with their backs to the north, and their heads down before there was any wind to bow, them and the light gone flattened yellow-gray as old ivory. I had seen my father read weather his whole life, and I read it now the way he taught me, and what it said made me bring Pell inside and bank the fire and check the bar on the door. The wind came at noon, And it came not as a gust, but as a wall, a single shove of air so cold it stopped the breath in your throat. And behind it came the snow, not falling but driven flat, moving sideways across the grass so fast it did not seem to touch the ground at all. By the middle of the afternoon, I could not see the spring at the bottom of the draw, 30 yards down. By dark, the cold had come down past anything I had known. The kind of cold that is not weather but a presence, that walks the walls of a house looking for a way in. I had banked the soddy with snow on the windward side, the way my father had shown me to bank a fish cellar against a Cornish gale, and the earth walls held the small heat of my little fire, and Pell and I lay close, and outside the wind found its second voice again, that thin, high whine under the roar, and it sang at the door all night and did not stop. It did not stop for 3 days. The thermometer Otto had given me, the one good instrument I owned, hung by the door, and on the second morning it read 36 degrees below zero, and the mercury sat in the bulb and would not climb. And on the third morning it had broken in the night and showed only that the cold had gone past, where the glass could follow. The snow drove so fine and so hard it came in through a seam in the door I had thought tight, a little ridge of it building on the floor by morning that did not melt, though it lay 6 feet from the fire, and I packed the seam with a strip of muslin and banked more snow against the outside, and learned the lesson the plains were teaching everyone that week, that a house is only as warm as its worst gap. The wind did not howl so much as press, a steady, enormous weight of moving cold that found the soddy and leaned on it hour after hour, and under the press ran that thin, high whine I had heard the night Otto left, the sound the wind makes when it has nothing kind left in it. I kept the fire small and steady, for a small fire fed all night is worth more than a great one let die, and I melted snow in the pot for water, and I brought Pell up close, and I waited the way my father had taught me to wait out a thing bigger than myself, which is to say without fighting it. I ate from my wall. That is a plain thing to say, and it carried the whole weight of those weeks. I took down a sleeve of venison and a measure of dried pumpkin chips and a handful of the hard beans, and I set them to swell in the melted snow over the small fire, and slow by slow, the dry amber chips drank the water back into themselves and grew soft and gold again, and the meat loosened from its leather into something a body could chew, and the soddy filled with a smell like September, like the warm afternoons when I had laid those very chips out on the screens, so that eating them was a little like eating the lost autumn itself. I ate, and Pell ate from my hand, and the storm leaned on the door and could not reach us. There is no describing to a warm and fed person what it is to be warm and fed inside a thing that is trying to kill everything outside it. It is not joy. It is something graver and deeper than joy. It is the thing my father must have felt as a boy in a stone cottage on a black coast, while the gale took the boats of careless men, and I understood him better in those 3 days than in all the years he lived. I want to set down here, plainly, the arithmetic of that winter, because it is the heart of everything, and my father taught me that numbers spoken quietly cut deeper than any cry. I had near 400 pounds of food and one mouth and one dog to feed, and I had wood enough banked under snow, and I had water from snow melted at the fire. I was not in danger. On the Rhine, in the worst cold the plains had given, in the memory of any man then living, I was warm and I was fed and I was not afraid. That was the gift my father left me, and it had no price on it, and no one could have taken it. I did not yet know what the storm was doing to the others, because no one could move and no one could see, and a person alone in a blizzard knows only the size of her own room. I learned it after, piece by piece, and it has never left me. The Tisdale place, where young Ruth had spoken up for me, ran low of fuel on the second day, for they had counted on hauling more from town, and the roads had closed, and Ruth's husband Amos went out to the barn for the last of the cobs, with a rope tied to his waist, the way you were told to, and he came back with his face white as a plate and could not feel his hands for an hour. They burned the corn meant for the cow. They burned a chair. By the time the wind dropped, they had eaten the seed corn boiled to a paste and had nothing left to plant in spring, which on the high plains is a slower kind of dying than cold. The hail store stood, for Cyrus had goods, but the family strung out along the draws, and the section lines did not have a store. They had what they had put by in the fall, and most of them had put by for an ordinary winter, and not for this. And most of them had laughed at the woman who put by for the worst. There is no satisfaction in writing that down. There were children in those houses. I have never once been glad of what that winter cost. On the 8th day the wind died, and the sun came up on a country I did not recognize. A white blank rolled out to every horizon with the fence tops and stovepipes, the only marks that men had ever lived there, and the cold so deep and still that the snow squeaked like dry leather underfoot and the breath froze in your scarf. I dug out my door. I climbed to the top of the rise to see what could be seen. And what I saw far off toward the Tisdale claim was a thread of no smoke at all where a chimney should have been. And that thread of nothing got me moving faster than any fear for myself ever had. I loaded a sledge my father's journal had taught me to lash from green willow. I packed it with dried meat and pumpkin and beans and a crock of plum paste and a sack of apple leather, and I put Pell in the traces beside me, and the two of us broke a trail across 2 miles of drifted snow toward a house with no smoke. I did not know what I would find. I knew only that I had food and they had none, and that my father had not taught me to keep a wall of plenty beside a house of the starving and call it mine. What I found at the Tisdale Soddy was a family alive but failing, 4 of them and a 5th on the way, the fire down to a red eye in the grate, and Ruth feeding it splinters pried from the table, and Amos in the bed unable to use his hands, and the children gone quiet, which is the sound that frightens a body worst of all, a child too cold and too hungry to cry. I did not make a speech. I built up their fire with the dry wood I had dragged, and I put a pot on, and I broke my dried stores into the water, the pumpkin and the meat and the beans, and the soddy filled with that smell of a stopped September. And I fed the children first, small spoons, slow, the way you bring a chilled thing back, so as not to harm it. And I watched the color come back into a little girl's face and her eyes find mine. Ruth sat down on the floor by the fire and put her face in her hands, and word went out, the way word does even in a buried country, by men breaking trail from house to count the living, and within 2 days they were coming to the Rhine, the Vogels and the Schmidts and a family of Danes from the north section, and others I had only nodded to in church, coming with sledges and with empty sacks and with their pride left at home, because pride is a summer crop, and this was the deep of winter, and I had what they did not, and I gave it. By the end of January, there were better than a dozen people who had eaten from my wall, and some of them slept those worst nights on my soddy floor, with Pell moving among them like a shepherd counting his flock, and not one of them went hungry, while my stores held, and my stores held longer than anyone could believe, because food dried right is food made small and light and lasting. 4 pounds of pumpkin shrunk to 1, and a single barrel feeding a family for a fortnight. The man who came last to my door was Cyrus Hale. He came on the last day of the month on a borrowed horse, because 2 girls from the Peterson place had walked to his store half frozen and told him where the food was and where it was not, and he had closed his store and ridden out the 11 miles to see the thing for himself. He stood in my doorway, the same doorway where Otto had named the danger and where Pell had decided we would stay, and he looked at the hung meat and the barrels and the ropes of onions and the people warming by my fire who were alive because of it, and his easy certainty was gone from his face entirely. He took off his hat. He stood a moment and said nothing, and the soddy was quiet but for the fire. And then Cyrus Hale, who had named me on his porch before his laughing men, said the only thing there was to say. I was a fool, he said. That was all. I told you I keep account of things. I have kept that one longest. I did not answer him with triumph, and I will tell you I felt none. I felt tired, and I felt the old ache for my father who should have lived to see his arrows fly true. And I felt, when I looked at the children asleep in the warm, something I have no better word for than peace. I gave Cyrus a bowl of the pumpkin soup and he ate it standing, and he looked at how the dried squash had swelled back to gold in the broth, and he asked me plainly, like a man who has decided to learn, how it was done. So I told him. I told him what my father told me, that you take a thing at the peak of its keeping, and you help it give up its water before the rot can start. That water is what the rot needs, and dryness is what the rot cannot cross. That the sun and the moving air do the work for nothing if you only give them the thin-cut flesh and the time. I did not make a speech of it. I said it the way my father said it, the feeling first and the words second, and Cyrus Hale listened to a woman he had called the Rind Woman, as if she were the wisest person in the county, which for that one winter, in the one thing that mattered, I suppose I was. The thaw came in March, slow and grudging, and the country counted its dead. And the count was heavy, more than 200 souls across the plains by the tallies that came later, and stock past any counting, whole herds standing frozen in the draws where they had drifted. The Rhind lost no one. That sentence is the only monument I ever wanted. In April, a man came out from the county seat, a clerk named Mr. Reese, a careful gray man who had been sent to set down the losses for the territorial record. And he came to the Rhind because the survivors kept sending him there, kept telling him that if he wished to record how people died, he ought also to record how some had lived. He sat at my table for the better part of a day with his ink and his ledger, and I showed him the journal, my father's lofts and racks, and the little arrows of the air, and I showed him the empty barrels and the few still full, and I told him the count of pounds and the count of mouths. He wrote it all down in his careful hand. He asked me to draw for him the rack that dried the squash, and the way the meat hung in the seep-cooled air, and he copied my father's arrows into his own book, and when he left he shook my hand, which no man in that county had done since Harlan Vance, folded a deed back into an envelope, and he said the territory would want to know how it was done. And it did. What Mr. Reese carried back to the county seat did not stay there. It went into a circular, the next autumn, a plain sheet sent out to the homestead claims across 3 counties before the snow, with my father's racks drawn on it, and the principal set down in words near to the words I had said over a bowl of soup. Take the thing at its peak and help it give up its water. The moving air and the sun will do the rest. They did not put my name on it, and I did not mind, for my name was never the thing that mattered, the knowledge was. The next fall the country smelled of drying. You would ride past a soddy and see screens in the sun and meat in muslin and ropes of onions hung in the eaves, and where the year before there had been one witch's chimney on a dead claim, there were now 100 lofts hung with plenty, and the men who had laughed on the porch were the ones hanging them. Not all who copied it understood it. Some laid their slices too thick and lost them to mold, and learned that the form is not the principle, that you cannot merely do what the wise woman did. You must know why she did it, and the ones who came back to ask me why were the ones whose lofts stayed sweet. That, my father would have said, is the whole of it. The hands can copy a thing in a season. The understanding takes longer to pass, and it is the only part that truly keeps. Ruth Tisdale's little girl, the one whose face I watched come back to color over a spoon of soup, grew up and married and dried for her own children, and taught her own children. And I am told there are women on that bench today, women I never met and never will, who hang their lofts each in a pattern that came down to them from a woman they know only as a story, who dry their gardens by my father's arrows without knowing whose hand first drew them. Cyrus Hale never called me anything but Miss Pierce again, and he sent his daughters to me to learn, and when he died, some years on, he left instruction that the circular be kept in the store, framed by the door, and it hung there until the store itself was gone. Della came to me in the spring after the hard winter alone on foot, and stood at my door where so many had stood, and she did not have the words, and neither did I, and so we did not use any. We only sat by the fire with the dog between us, two sisters who had each survived a different cold, and that was as much mending as the world allowed us, and it was enough. I am an old woman now, and I have outlived nearly everyone in this telling, and Pell is 50 years in the ground at the head of the draw where he used to walk the neighbors home. The soddy on the rind fell in long ago, the poles I set rotted, and the sod went back to the grass it came from, and the bench is in wheat now, and a stranger farms it who does not know it was ever called anything but good ground. I went back once, an old woman in a hired buggy, and stood where my doorway had been, where Otto had named the danger, and Cyrus had named himself a fool, and Della had come at last with no words, and there was nothing there but a low green swell in the wheat, and the same wind that had always come across that high tableland with nothing to slow it. I had thought I would feel the loss of the place. What I felt instead was the wind, and the wind had not changed at all. It still moved through the country off the grass the way it had moved the day I laid apple rings on a screen, the way it had moved through my father's loft in a Cornish town he left as a boy, carrying the water up and away, helping the harvest give itself up so that it might keep. My father told me the only inheritance worth the name is the kind that lives in the hands and cannot be stolen or burned or voted away. I did not believe him while he lived, and I have spent a long life learning that he was right in every part. They cast me out before the harvest with a tin trunk and a dog and a head full of a dead man's arrows, and I dried everything I could, and the winter that starved the county and took more than 200 souls never once starved me nor anyone who reached my door. The men who laughed on a warm porch became the men who hung their lofts by my father's plan, and their children's children hang them yet, on a bench where my name is forgotten, and the knowledge is not, which is the right way around of it, and the only monument I ever wanted. The wind does not stop. It never has. Somewhere on that high ground this very fall, in a loft I will never see, it is lifting the water out of someone's harvest, drying it sweet and light against a winter that has not yet shown its face, and it does not know my name, and it does not need to.